you're looking for Red Bull content, then I'm about to serve you some. Straight. Despite Max Verstappen dragging the RB21 to places it shouldn't be, the team is still marred in needless distraction. And Red Bull can't count on the sister team backing them up. No, they're just making matters worse by actually going against the grain. Red Bull is a team in turmoil. Internal battles are brewing, not just over technical performance, but also over clashing leadership visions, driver futures, and the role of its junior team. This disconnect between Christian Horner and Helmut Marko as to the things that went down after the Australian Grand Prix weekend was all said and done, it's really indicating that Red Bull is at a major crossroads right now. As I've said in previous videos, it needs a cultural shift. But how is it expected to do that when you've got these two men completely divided? All it's going to do is just present a fractured team, no matter what the technical department can do to help Max Verstappen's championship campaign. It's only going to make all of the other rival teams feel more confident about their own lot and giving more ammunition toward them. Zach Brown does not need any more ammunition against Red Bull. And even if Christian Horner is working his hardest to try and shift the narrative around Red Bull to portray it as a more open, self-reflective outfit, even preparing for a future without Max Verstappen, his efforts are being undercut by one Helmut Marko, whose latest remarks created another PR disaster. Because even though Max Verstappen pulled off a spectacular weekend to come within a second of a potential and surprise victory, because I don't even think he was expecting to get anywhere near the top of the dais whatsoever in Australia. Now, just a couple of days later, most of that has just been pushed to the side, and what happened at turn 2 of the formation lap is still an ongoing conversation, which is something I don't think Red Bull wanted or needed. Helmut Marko's remarks on Austrian television, likely assuming they wouldn't reach the English-speaking world, backfired spectacularly when he publicly criticised Isack Hadjar for showing emotion after his surprise crash on the formation lap, calling it a bit embarrassing. At a time when it's desperately trying to win fans back to show that it can change, well, what this has just shown is that, no, they cannot change unless somebody is changed, and that somebody hails from Austria. Because all that people are talking about right now is how Red Bull treats its young talents. Now, of course, this does bring up a very important issue, and it's clear that Marko and Horner are not in agreement with what was said by the former. Not long after that, Christian Horner took a far more consoling view of the matter, reminding people of what Hadjar had accomplished in practice and qualifying, where the rain wasn't a factor whatsoever. And I cannot stress enough how important that was. Say what you will about Christian Horner, there are times where he does come to the defense of his drivers far more than what Dr. Marko does, and this was very much needed because people must remember, in practice, Hadjar held his own, and in qualifying, out of all of the rookies, even though Kimi Antonelli had damage to his car that saw him out in Q1, Isack qualified the highest out of all 6 of them, including his colleague Liam Lawson. Well, I mean, there's plenty to say about him and his role in the organisation, and his lot really doesn't help with the entire conversation about Red Bull toxicity with its junior programme, but that's not the main topic for today. Because Hadjar's emotional reaction, it wasn't just about frustration, it was a rare insight, I think, into the brutal expectations of the Red Bull junior team. His raw emotions, and then Anthony Hamilton's quiet support with that really warm embrace, it resonated deeply with fans, proving that drivers aren't machines, they're people. And let's be real here, what happened with Isack is not something that is new. This is not the first time an F1 car has been binned on the formation lap, and nor will it be the last. Because may I remind you, Max Verstappen himself binned his car into the barriers in Hungary 2020 when going to the grid before the formation lap. Juan Pablo Montoya, he spanned the car when all of them were approaching the start-finish straight at the end of said lap in 2006. These are just 2 examples, and the whole situation also is exacerbated by the fact that most likely this was the first time Isack Hadjar had actually raced that particular V-Carbo 2 in the wet on any sort of intermediate or wet tyre. The same applies for pretty much every single rookie up and down the grid in terms of that particular spec of car. But they will improve from this. It will build character for not just Hadjar, but also the rookies, because you only have to look at what Isaac's comments are when he has arrived at Shanghai, knowing that he will have learnt from that weekend and that he will be a better person. What happened during that weekend has not thrown him for a loop, and that embrace from Anthony Hamilton, I think, actually saved his career, or at least probably did much more good than whatever bollocking Helmut Marko would have given him later on. And it also does bring up a fascinating train of thought. Does the Red Bull Junior team as it is right now work anymore? Because arguably, in the last few years, it has not really produced the same amount and specification of driver that we have seen in previous iterations back in the 2010s when they were really at their peak. This is not me casting dispersion on the drivers specifically, it's more to do with how they've been maintained and developed. Because has the way Hadjar expressed himself and the way that the wider world has embraced him even more akin to the father of Sir Lewis Hamilton, may that actually spark change within that program? Well, the answer isn't simple. It depends on which era of F1 that you align with. Historically, the sport glorified Stoicism, where emotions were seen as weaknesses in a hyper-competitive, male-dominated environment. Michael Schumacher has famously said that he would never show his true emotions, that he would keep himself as private as possible. But times are changing, I believe. With growing awareness toward mental health, modern drivers, especially Lando Norris, advocate for emotional openness, signalling a shift in what defines mental fortitude in Formula One. Now, I will openly admit, when I grew up as a young boy, looking at motorsport and the classic images of Formula One drivers, yes, including one Graham Hill, going around the likes of Monte Carlo in those cigar-like tube cars that could easily go into the water at any moment, yes, that was all great fun. It looked wild, fascinating, dangerous. The lifestyle was glamorous. It was like, oh, okay, this is appealing to my young male mind. But needless to say, with that naivete, you don't really realise all of the stuff that goes behind the scenes. And I seriously recommend to you watching Grand Prix 1966. I believe it's currently on Prime right now, but I think it's not only really good understanding of what life was like to be an F1 driver in the 60s, because there were plenty of high-profile drivers from that era that were consultants, but I think it will also give you an understanding about the new F1 movie that's coming out in the summer. And much like the 60s, Helmut Marko is a relic of that bygone era, resisting modern shifts in driver development and mental well-being. Because his blunt approach dismisses emotional displays like Hadjar's, reinforcing the old-school belief that showing vulnerability equates to weakness. It is something that is modelled by his protege, Max Verstappen, and I also find it particularly galling for anyone in that junior team right now about the comments that Helmut Marko made not that long ago in relation, I think, to Oliver Goethe, when he was showing potential in the junior categories, that there was no point looking for a new Max Verstappen because it no longer exists. Way to tell your rookies that they have no chance in trying to emulate, equal, or maybe surpass the likes of Max Verstappen. Because as we've seen time and time again, it does happen. The greats are equalled and then beaten by the new guard. And I think Kimi Antonelli stands a really good chance to do that. I am so glad the hype is now crystallizing into reality. And by the way, this next bit is not to cast dispersion on Max, it just shows that this kind of emotional outpouring can happen to the best of us. But what about those pictures of him that were seen during the Turkish Grand Prix of 2020, when he was just taking a moment to collect himself? It was in public. Yeah, even though Max may be a machine, he is still human. Many now argue that showing emotion isn't weakness, it's proof of the immense pressure drivers face, and humanises them in a way that has never been possible, and it therefore makes them more relatable and easier to follow as fans of those particular races. And again, Lando Norris and the like are proving time and time again that being aware of one's mental health is not some kind of flaw, it can be a strength, because you've only got to look at the beginning of this season and during the winter. Lando Norris has done a fantastic job in responding to the critics of last year and all of the comments of Lando no-wins and Lando bottling poles. Yeah, there is still some work to do, but he has certainly improved immensely, to the point where his good old buddy Max Verstappen was congratulating him, and they also had a good ding-dong battle where Lando didn't crack. And I saw this one video on TikTok from @offtrack.limits, I'm on there too by the way, which explained to me the clearest I had ever seen that female F1 fans in particular notice different things to male F1 fans. It blew my mind, I get it now. I seriously recommend you watch that particular TikTok. I may never be able to comprehend it for the rest of my days, but at least I now know it's there, and it explains why Formula One has become so popular as a global sporting phenomena. It just makes so much sense. Thank you! And it may have got people up and down the grid starting to also realise that maybe the old ways of forging races as emotionless powerhouses may be coming to an end. Because what last weekend did it sparked the latest flare-up and introspection into the way Red Bull does things, and how there is further work needed to be done to adapt to the way Formula One operates, how its drivers develop, and handle the tougher-than-ever scrutiny from all sides, and whether or not the old guard need to just simply keep up with the times, learn and grow as people, or simply just move on, simply decide that it's not for them, or figure out what else they can be providing Formula One based on their own wealth of experience. Because not only do you see Christian Horner trying to be the conciliatory mentor figure in trying to amp up the achievements of his drivers, you're seeing everyone trying their utmost to be careful and diplomatic, and you want to know something funny? The events revolving around Hadjar may have potentially sparked Alpine to reflect on what they've been doing lately with Jack Doohan, or not been doing lately, because team principal Oliver Oakes, yes, he's the team principal of that operation by the way, not Flavio Briatore, came out to the wider media and finally admitted that his team had not been doing enough to support their Australian rookie amongst the noise and chatter regarding Franco Colapinto. Thank you! It took them long enough, didn't it? But anyway, here's what they had to say for your amusement. I think it's fair to say we've caused a lot of the noise. You know, being open, I think we haven't put him in the best position there. But I also think, flip it the other way, we've got a duty as a team to perform. I think we've got 3 or 4 reserves now, and as a team, we need to do that because it is right with one eye to the future. But I feel for Jack because at the end of the day, probably all that noise was brought on from what we did. By the same token, if you're good and you can handle it, you deserve to be an F1. Well, I mean, in the case of Jack Doohan, quite honestly, I thought he did a particularly decent job in Australia because in practice, he was not only close to Pierre Gasly, sometimes he was actually besting him. He was only a few places off of Pierre in qualifying, so not too bad actually for his first outing. Yeah, he got caught out by the rain, but so did many other drivers, so you can't really use that argument, can you? And if what Dr. Marko said regarding Hadjar finally got the now infamously unsupported team regarding Doohan to look inwards for once, then you know there's a need for some changing of minds to be had here. That all that Helmut is doing is casting dispersion, derision, and division amongst his own squads. Because I'm not just talking about Red Bull Racing here, I'm talking about the other Red Bull team, Racing Bulls. Because time and time again the last few months, I have seen Racing Bulls not singing from the same hymn sheet as Red Bull Racing. And that is a really surprising and alarming situation for that entire group to find itself in. That there is dissociation. It's particularly striking and mildly hilarious to see that this particular team, the junior team, is disconnecting itself from what the manager of the juniors of Red Bull is even saying. The sister team Racing Bulls is appearing to operate under far more supportive and developmental ethos. Because ever since he took over that squad after Franz Tost, Laurent Mekies, he's been a bit of a complex enigma to try and figure out, really. Sure, the team hasn't kicked on in terms of performance the way he might have expected, to try and really get that P5 in the constructors that he and the shareholders have been desperately wanting ever since they became Toro Rosso and then AlphaTauri and then Visa Cash Up Racing RB and now Racing Bulls. Finally, they sorted that out. But at the same time, you get the feeling that Racing Bulls is becoming the complete opposite of Red Bull Racing, because there is more and more evidence to say that this organisation is a lovely place to be in, that it is incredibly supportive, and that the team principal fully backs his drivers and is unwaveringly supportive of them. He will have their backs no matter what. And you get the feeling that everyone in that community and that team really sings from that same particular hymn sheet. Yeah, Helmut, take note. Mekies will defend his guys to the ends of the earth, lamenting if things simply don't work out instead of openly mocking them, and sometimes he even questions what goes on with Red Bull Racing and the group itself, actually spreading some seeds of speculation. Because this divide is even clearer, especially in how Racing Bulls handled Yuki Tsunoda's disappointment over missing that Red Bull promotion. Now, you would have expected Racing Bulls to have completely ignored that situation or just looked to 2025, grateful for that Yuki was still with them. But no, you keep hear Laurent Mekies saying how surprised he was that Yuki wasn't considered for promotion, and sort of aligning and justifying the beliefs of Tsunoda, empowering them, which really in of itself sparks some sort of division between those two organisations. Surely if this is meant to be the pipeline toward the senior team, you want it to be somewhat consistent, because you have this one team and then you go to the other team, and if it operates completely differently, then the rookies that are prepared there are not prepared for what goes on up there. So, yeah, there needs to be some sort of consensus. Because unlike that cutthroat culture up there, with Marko just overseeing them with his beady eye, Lauren Mecky's leadership appears more supportive, acknowledging that talent development isn't just about results, it's about growth, trust, opportunity. And I don't think you need me to tell you that Racing Bulls has been quite obvious in expressing their surprise that their junior talent who had grown with them for 4 years had still proven to not be good enough for a seat at Red Bull Racing. Not necessarily denying the notion it was a political move, which Yuki Tsunoda is constantly maintaining, and now that Honda has redefined its relationship with Yuki and has allowed him to become a little bit more autonomous in the way he manages himself, this might kick on even further. And if Yuki is able to produce results that we saw in qualifying, but then were thwarted accidentally by his team, then we could easily see him making the Red Bull Racing posse squirm, especially if Liam Lawson continues the trend that second Red Bull seat is absolutely cursed, no matter who is in it. Yuki, though, he seems to be up for the challenge, and quite honestly, he's going to be leaving the Red Bull organisation anyway next year, so what has he got left to lose? Everyone knows that seat is cursed, so they're not exactly going to criticise him for it, and I don't think he really cares anymore. And the team where he is at right now seems to be moving away from that model, which historically has generated incredibly successful drivers in the sport. At the same time, though, whenever you hear from folks nowadays such as Sebastian Vettel, Carlos Sainz, Alex Albon, Mark Webber, Daniel Ricciardo, they all discuss how hard it was to operate in those conditions under Marko's authority, and that at times they would struggle and wish for a warmer mentor. Because just because they were able to survive the storms of that Red Bull Junior program doesn't mean that they would like those days, that they would have had some really low moments, and yes, it's up to their own personal character that saw them rise above it. In any case, Dr. Marko's uncompromising approach appears to be creating an even more significant rift within the Red Bull organisation after all of the trials and tribulations of 2024. It just won't go away. And it really just reminds you of the decline of Sergio Perez from mid-2023 onwards. It wasn't just about performance, it was worsened by Marko's relentless public criticism. Because do you remember a couple of years ago, when Sergio Perez was actually starting off the season really well, and then, as was found out after the Spanish Grand Prix, the car was being developed away from him, and then the team simply ignored his concerns and alarm bells, it then put him in the crosshairs of Helmut Marko. And almost every single race, there was some kind of negative comment aimed toward the Mexican driver, which would then manifest and snowball into this massive pool of hatred amongst Western media, who would then just cast aspersion and call for his head. I got caught up in that. I am not ashamed to admit that, and I am ashamed of myself. But now we've all found out what happened during those times, and I feel incredibly sorry for what Checo had to go through. He had to put up with a lot through that, and it can easily be argued that had he not had that criticism, Checo might have been able to bounce back. And it just seems that people have forgotten all that Perez was able to achieve before 2023. In his times with Force India and Racing Point, he was a really good driver. But people just seem to have forgotten that, whether conveniently or simply just for the fact that it got weighed down by all of the negative comments and, of course, the struggling with the car itself. But all of this disconnect only undermines team unity that Christian Horner's trying to get back. It risks diminishing Red Bull's overall performance and achievements as they seek to turn the fate of the RB21 around into a more competitive machine that can give Max Verstappen his 5th world title, even if it does go down to the final race. And this internal strife with Red Bull, it isn't just a PR headache, it could have real consequences. Low morale, relentless public scrutiny, Helmut Marko constantly going at odds with Christian Horner, these could provide really unnecessary distractions that could lead Max Verstappen to either fall off the pace or have these things swirling in his head, or maybe force him to reconsider his options for his future within Formula One, be it with another team or at all. Because despite having a car which he found out in Australia that he can still extract performance from, would he still want to be part of a team that is bringing all of this relentless drama to his doorstep? No. No driver would want that, even the best. Because at some point the distractions will outweigh the rewards of staying with that group. So to address this issue and maybe restore unity, Red Bull must begin by aligning its leadership messaging so that figures like Horner, team management, and Dr. Marko present one cohesive vision to the media. Now, this might require a shift from blunt public criticism toward a more constructive form of feedback that encourages growth without alienation. Or if that is simply not possible for Dr. Marko to try and do, or he simply just does not want to do it, then maybe a redefining of his job description may be in order to maybe change his responsibilities to something that is more direct with the junior drivers and less being around the paddock at every single Grand Prix. Remember, he's meant to be focusing on the junior guys, so he should be really focusing himself on the F2 and F3 paddock when they're knocking around in the race weekend of Formula 1, instead of just being clung to the side of Max Verstappen, because Max doesn't really need your help, Helmut, because, well, he's doing his thing. And let's remember, he doesn't work for Red Bull Racing. He is an advisor for the Red Bull Group itself. Additionally, the team should invest in robust support structures that prioritize mental health and long-term development as part of the Red Bull Junior program. By nurturing its drivers holistically, providing psychological support, fostering an environment that allows for genuine expression of emotion, and being told it's okay to feel that way, Red Bull can maybe help its talents weather setbacks without the fear that a single poor performance could be an ending of their career. Because as I've said multiple times now, if Red Bull wants to remain relevant and a really popular team, it has to evolve. It is set in its ways. And I find this incredibly ironic in the situation that it found itself in when it arrived in 2005. It was the party team. It was there to disrupt the status quo. Well, now it's become the status quo, and it doesn't know how to get itself out of its rut. The days of rootless cutthroat driver management also are fading, replaced by a more modern human approach. And Isack Hadjar's reaction wasn't weakness, it was a wake-up call. The contrasting response from Anthony Hamilton, who simply offered Hadjar understanding instead of judgment, proves that F1 is moving beyond Marko's rigid philosophy. Hadjar not only humanized the internal pressures and machinations that go into a high-performing Formula 1 driver that is amongst 19 other people who find themselves in their position, but it also provides us as fans a means to understand them as people. These are human beings at the end of the day. These are young men. In effect, his outpouring has shone a light on the need for a more balanced approach, one that still holds drivers to high performance standards because this is F1, but it also must acknowledge and support the very human side of their experience. And this debate is central to determining whether Red Bull can maintain its competitive edge without alienating its talent, or if a shift towards a more nurturing culture might be essential for long-term success. Because going back to that point that Marko said that there would never be another Max Verstappen, maybe that is true. Maybe the way that Max Verstappen was forged in the pits of the Netherlands cannot be emulated, and a new way of bringing out the best of talents may be needed. And I'm certainly seeing this with the likes of Mercedes and Kimi Antonelli. Maybe Toto could find some catharsis in allowing Max to get away from him that decade ago, because he's got one with Massimiliano Verstappeno. I mean, Kimi Antonelli. Toto Wolff may no longer need Max Verstappen. Although I do believe he will be constantly looking at the Dutchman, he may not need to call upon his services. To find out why I really believe Max Verstappen is not destined for Mercedes, and that Toto will believe in the ones that he's got already, watch this video next, straight after this one.